In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, let me begin by thanking the Islamic Society at Sussex University for inviting me. I think it's my second time that I've spoken here, and also choosing this important topic. And thank you for all of you for attending on this very cold day. And hopefully you'll find the lecture informative and enlightening. Now, Bertrand Russell, the noted philosopher, once said that we shouldn't judge a religion by its adherents. And what he meant by this was to say that just because we have good religious people, that it does not mean that a religion that they subscribe to is necessarily good. So if we have good Christians, it does not mean that Christianity is good. And I think that's true, and also the opposite is also true. That just because we have bad religious people, it does not reflect in any shape or form the state of that religion, what the religion says. So if we have, for example, if we see a vicar mugging an old age pensioner, it would be ridiculous to conclude that Christianity advocates robbing, mugging old age pensioners, right? So for the same reason, it is inaccurate and also fallacious to malign the entire Islamic faith and everyone who holds to it for the actions of a few Muslim extremists. And might I also add that the word Islam originates from the root word salima, which means security, means to be at peace. And the very notion of talking about terrorism and Islam is almost an oxymoron. But the current view is that Islam is a religion of violence, that it lends itself to violence. For example, outspoken critic Sam Harris says, who is a militant atheist from the States, he says Osama bin Laden is giving a truly straightforward version of Islam. And you really have to be an acrobat to figure out how he is distorting the faith. So what Sam Harris is saying here, that Osama bin Laden is a true Muslim. He's going by the book. If you want to understand Islam, look at Osama bin Laden. Now, if we were to play a word association game, you know how it works. I say cat and you say dog, for example. And we started with the word Islam. You wouldn't be surprised if someone said terrorist or violence, extremist. That would be quite common, right? Yes, I think so. We have come to assume that kind of image of Islam. There is this type of public opinion that Islam is indeed inherently a religion of violence. But this association didn't happen overnight. Now, if we just went approximately 100 years back, the stereotype of Islam would have been very, very different. Very, very different. Just 100 years ago, the image that Islam was seen to be was fatalistic, pleasure-loving, and also indolent, and always late for lectures. And for example, Hegel, the philosopher, in particular associated Islam with a sense of lethargy. You know, this idea of the pasha smoking hubbly-bubbly shisha, enjoying his Turkish delight and his slave girls. That was the image around 100 years ago. So it's clear that things have changed. And how did that change happen? But I think what would be insightful would be to look at psychology, for example. Because in psychology, there's this understanding. Who's studying psychology here? Great. I better get my facts right. In psychology, there's something known as anchoring. And this is where we analyze how associations are made in the mind. And for example, if you walk into a store and you hear some music playing, and suddenly you're immersed with all these good feelings, these good memories, Why? Because your subconscious mind has linked that music with those great memories at the time. And some clever person, by the name of Pavlov, a Russian psychologist, worked out that you could actually do this artificially. You can build these links in your associations in your mind artificially. And he has a famous experiment called Pavlov's dog. Is that right? Yeah. Oh, excellent. And what he does here is he has a bell, and he rings the bell, and he feeds his dog. And he worked out, with repetition, is that you can build these anchors. So when he rang the bell, the dog started to salivate. Why? Because the dog associated subconsciously that the bell meant food. Now, this also works with negative associations and negative feelings to things. So in neuro-linguistic programming, they use this phenomena, they use this technique to break filthy habits. So for example, smoking. They would basically anchor a negative feeling when someone sees a cigarette. You know, maybe you think, you know, as soon as you see a cigarette, you see your mother-in-law or your boss or whatever it may be, right? Whatever works for that individual. Now, so it comes as no surprise that with the media constantly projecting images of Muslims' violence, Muslims' terrorism, that we have in the mind of the public that Islam is actually a religion of violence. It comes as no surprise. It's just bound to happen if you constantly, over time, with repetition, pump these images. We are going to be conditioned to believe in a certain way, and that is to believe that Islam is a religion of violence. Now, the question is, that sort of perception is not necessarily reality, so how likely are Muslims to actually commit acts of terrorism? Well, if we look at the files, the stats according to the FBI, statistically, Muslims are the community least likely to commit terrorist acts against civilians. According to official FBI records, only 6% of terrorist acts on US soil happened between 1980 and 2005 were committed by Muslims, Muslim extremists. The remaining 94% were from other groups. For example, the Puerto Ricans were 16 times more likely to commit, they were far more likely to commit than Muslims on US soil. The Europol reports that 99.6% of attacks are classified as terrorism by police had nothing to do with Muslims. Most of them were by leftist organizations, were 16 times more likely to commit crimes of the terrorist nature to harm and maim individuals than Muslims were. Only 4% of terrorism between 2007 and 2009 were attributed by European police to extremist Muslims. So what about suicide bombing? You often get this notion, if you go onto Islamophobe websites and readings, that Muslims somehow have this, long for this desire, they romanticize about blowing themselves up, right? Sam Harris, for example, again, has described Islam as a death cult. Well, how likely is this? Well, again, let's have a look at some facts and statistics. Professor Robert Papp, in his book Dying to Win, documents the history of terrorism, particularly suicide bombing. And his findings are that suicide bombing is not exclusive to Muslims, not exclusive to Muslims. What he does here, he analyzes two periods of history, pre-Iraq invasion and post. And what he finds is that when he looks at 1980-2003, pre-invasion of Iraq, there were 343 completed terrorist suicide attacks defined in the classical sense. What he means by this is, it's where someone kills himself or herself with the objective of maiming or killing other people. And The world leader during this period was not Muslims, but the Tamil Tigers from Sri Lanka, a Marxist secular Hindu group, and who committed more suicide attacks than Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Moreover, 1/3 of the suicide attacks are by not religious, but secular groups like the PKK in Turkey, a Marxist anti-religious group, and almost 50% of what's deemed to be Muslim suicide bombings are not even associated with Islamic fundamentalism in any shape or form. So the view that we've been conditioned to believe that, let's say that Islam is a driving force behind suicide bombing, just simply does not fit the stats and the data. And in the words of Professor Papp, he says, it does not hold. It doesn't hold up to the facts. Interestingly, what he says is that 95% of the suicide terror attacks, what they have in common is the strategy to repel occupying forces of their land, what they consider to be their land, democratic occupying forces from their land. That's what they have in common. And he also says this, he says the link between smoking and cancer is 85%. He says the empirical linkage with suicide bombing and occupation is 95%. It's much stronger. It's much stronger. So the determining factor is of occupation, not religion, not Islam. So it's evidently clear that the media present Muslim acts of terrorism in a disproportionate way and, in fact, filter out non-Muslim acts of terrorism. Thus, what do we have? This hysteria, this paranoia that Muslims are just waiting to pounce on the West, sleeper cells, and want to take over. That is where, in actual fact, when we look at religious communities, we look at the Islamic religious community compared to other communities that have been quite peaceful. Nevertheless, that said, there is still this fringe movement, very small minority of Muslims that engage in terrorist attacks. And they do so by using the justification of jihad. Under the banner of jihad, they actually go around blowing people and things up. Now, what I want to argue, can I have some water? Yeah. If you just take that one, that's fine. Don't worry, I'm not stealing from a kid, he's my son. Yeah. Oh, it's empty? Oh, okay, great. Never mind. I'll just bring it. Sure, okay. So, we do have people that commit such acts. But what I want to argue this evening is that the view that thinks that we can justify terrorism under the banner of jihad is incompatible on two fronts. The first is incompatible with the philosophy of jihad, what the whole point of jihad is, and also secondly, that it is a contradiction, incompatible with the theological injunctions pertaining to jihad. So first, let's have a look at the philosophical reasonings behind jihad and why it's a problem. Often you may hear jihad described as holy war. But this is incorrect. Jihad is not holy. What is holy, and this is a term that's sort of adopted through the Christian history. It's a Christian-centric term, not a Muslim one. And what is holy is what jihad is aiming for, what the point of jihad is, the objective of jihad. And the objective is to establish peace and justice. And if jihad, which is the vehicle to achieve that, does not conform to those virtues, then it is not jihad. Call it whatever you want, but it is not jihad. It must conform to those virtues. So, thus the mode of jihad is, and this is very important now, is to remove the obstacle in the way of peace and justice. That is what a jihad is. It is not good in and of itself. It is good in so far as what it achieves, right? And that is the premise of jihad. This is the fundamental premise of jihad. Jihad is seen as a regrettable act, but a necessary. But an act that must come into play. Unfortunately, but it must come into play. And this is the premise that extremist Muslims get wrong. They have the first premise, the foundation of jihad, confused. And that's why they commit such acts of violence. And so it is a regrettable act, but a necessary evil, if you like, if you want to use those terms. And the Quran says fighting is prescribed to you although you dislike it. The Quran here is indicating, and indicates in other verses, a caution and warning for enthusiasm for war. Okay? So what we find in the traditions is that the Quran dislikes the enthusiasm and warns against it. And where the Quran says fighting is prescribed to you, thank you very much, prescribed to you though you dislike it, the aversion here is a virtue. However, it must not translate and manifest into cowardice. And the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, a hadith as in the narration, a tradition, what he has said, in this case, he says, do not look forward to meeting your enemy on the battlefield, but when you encounter him, stand strong. Now, that is the philosophy of jihad. What about the one who partakes in jihad, who is involved in jihad? Can he be gung-ho, bloodthirsty, warmongering? No, absolutely not. The prerequisite of fighting jihad, the outward jihad, if you like, to engage in warfare, is the inner jihad. Is the inner jihad to overcome, to control the inner self, the ego, if you like. And that is why the Prophet said the greatest jihad, the greater jihad, is the jihad of the self. Before you go out there conquering lands, you must conquer yourself. Why? Why is this important? Because if the ego is involved in warfare, then inevitably you will end up in a disastrous result. But if the ego is controlled, if we have self-discipline, if we are disciplined and virtue is in the driving seat of the person, then inevitably it will end up with justice. Only then. Because only then, when the person is disciplined, that no longer following out their whims and desires, but what they're following out is the will of God. The will of God, namely the good. There's an interesting hadith that brings this to light. And there's a tradition of Imam Ali, who was a cousin of the Prophet, and when he was engaged in warfare, he encountered the enemy, and they started to engage, cross swords. And he overcome him, and his opponent fell on the floor, and he was about to strike him, and then the man spat in his face. And so what Imam Ali did at that time, the cousin of the Prophet, he dropped his sword and walked away. And when they asked him, they said, Ya Ali, why did you walk away? He was there, you could have had him. Your long-term enemy, your foe. And he said, when he spat in my face, I became angry. And had I killed him at that point, I would have killed him for myself because of my anger, not for God. And that brings to light exactly what this is when we're talking about the individual has to be disciplined, that the person must control his ego. Now, so what we can say is a piety or a kind of saint-like character is a necessary condition for someone to engage in warfare. Now, from the Western perspective, however, this is rather peculiar. How can a pious man of the cloth, if you like, be involved in warfare? And this is one of the main reasons this is one of the main reasons, sorry, I will bring them back. Yeah. This is one of the main reasons why the West has a problem with Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Because they can't comprehend, how can this man, who is a man of God, be involved, be married, and be involved in warfare? How can that actually work? That really does not sound like a godly man. And that is because they have, what is in the West now, they have this idea of sainthood as this person who is really detached. The saint is someone who is detached from all that is bodily. And in order for that person to be free, they must be detached from all the worldly matters, including marriage. For example, many saints in the West did not get married. They saw it as a detachment, and that would naturally extend to also warfare. Now, from the Islamic perspective, that's not the case, right? That's not the case. That from the Islamic perspective, we understand that the human being has two composites: the physical and the spiritual, and they must work together. There must be an equilibrium with the two. If one is unbalanced, then the other will be unbalanced. Now, if we look, maybe there is a problem from the West, but if we look from the Far East, then this idea fits very well, because in the Far East we have the sacred warrior idea, the samurai, right? The idea of a pious soldier. That fits very, very well. And what the samurai is a state of discipline, spiritual and physical, in order to follow out the errand of protecting the weak. That is what the samurai tradition is, the Bushido, the way of the warrior. And Bushido is underpinned by 7 virtues. For example, rectitude, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty. The samurai, as well as yielding a sword, must be able to fulfill these virtues in their life. Now, has anyone seen the film The Last Samurai? Hands up. Okay, fantastic film. Those that haven't seen it, please see it. Don't worry, put aside your reservations for Tom Cruise. It's a fantastic film, right? I know he's a Scientologist, but don't worry about that. He's a very good actor, and the film's great, right? And you can see these virtues play out in the film when Tom Cruise, who plays a chap called Nathan Algren, and Nathan Algren is a general from the American Army who's sent over to Japan to train the new Japanese government in sort of Western-style conflict and conscript. And he's also paid a hefty sum. And he's someone who has a track record of being in conflict in the civil wars in America and also against the Native Indians. So, this character, what he does is that he gets captured in the first battle. He gets captured by the rebel Japanese samurai, who are very unhappy with this new type of government. So in the first battle, he trains the Japanese army. They go into battle, and he gets massacred. He loses miserably, and he gets captured. And Katsumoto is the lord of that samurai tribe, a clan, if you like. And you can see the dialogue, throughout the dialogue and the interaction that Nathan has with the samurai people, that these virtues are coming out. For example, they treat him like a guest. Even though he's a prisoner of war, they treat him like a guest. They take him to the home, and guess whose home they take him to? They take him to the widow of the man that he killed on the battlefield when he first got caught. And they treat him like he was like a brother or a relative, a long-lost relative. They feed him, they clothe him, they wash his clothing. And you can see the value of honor there. That they see soldiers as human beings. Yes, we have an encounter on the battlefield, but after that's finished, then we're back to normal. People are just doing what they're doing. There's no ego involved. There's no quest for revenge there. And there's a fantastic dialogue between the two, between Katsumoto and Nathan Algren. And So if you recall, I said that he fought in the native Indian conflicts, and because of this he was haunted, and he had nightmares about what he saw and what he personally did. So Katsumoto says to him, "I've heard that you have nightmares." And Nathan Algren says to him, and he looks at him in a stern way and says, "Every soldier has nightmares." And Katsumoto says, "Only those who are ashamed of what they have done." Only those who are ashamed of what they have done. For Katsumoto, it doesn't make sense for a soldier to be ashamed, to regret his actions of what he's done on the battlefield. Why? Because being virtuous and fighting are one of the same things. And we see that kind of clash, and which we will discuss later on, how we understand how to train soldiers today and how we did many centuries before in ancient cultures. So this type of disciplined fighter, this warrior, is equal in the Islamic tradition. So piety comes as Muslims, as a pious person. The way in which we get piety is by living out the attributes of our Creator, and the Creator has 99 names, and by living out on a day-to-day basis those moral attributes, then we can become pious, and those attributes come in two, for example, beauty and rigor. So the Jamal and the Jalal. So the man of God, or saint-like individual, in Islamic understanding manifests these types of qualities in day-to-day life. The saint not only upholds virtues like compassion, generosity, mercy, but also courage. Does not show a blind eye to the injustices in the world, and does not show cowardice, but also fights to uphold peace and justice. So the Islamic conception of a saint is one who upholds this justice in the world. And may the pious man in Islam may also be a warrior, may also be in a fight and be involved in warfare, which is very close to the Far Eastern concepts, as we've discussed. So, in contrast, so what we have is this ancient culture is the individual who fights, just as the samurai does not crave for the battlefield, but craves for the result of the battlefield, which is justice and peace and the protection of the weak. In contrast, when we look at the West, it's very, very different. And we can see why that conflict happened with those two characters in that film. What do they do in today's armies in the West? They create killing machines. They desensitize the individual to block out their feelings and make them almost subhuman. They dehumanize the individual. And which is very different, because the ancient cultures, for example, traditional cultures like Islam and the samurai, what they're teaching is to make them enlightened human beings. Whereas the Western culture now, in training soldiers, is to dehumanize them, making them into robots without any feelings, so they can carry out their jobs. And the sole purpose is looking at how well they can fulfill tasks, how well they can hold a gun, and so forth, rejecting the inner discipline, which is vital. Now, does this necessarily lead to problems? Well, I think so. I think that without that indispensable inner training of the character that is prescribed by Islam and the samurai, let's say, that what we have is those virtuous concepts, those virtuous precepts are lost in the mind of the soldier. So during the First World War, one fighter pilot was quoted as saying, "I was gung-ho the whole way. It was kind of neat." And another one was asked, "Are you looking forward to doing it again?" And he replied, "Absolutely." One said, "I felt like a young athlete after his first football match." This is reported of what these soldiers said when they entered into Iraq. And so you can sense the elation in killing here. the elation, the joy of actually encountering the enemy and actually killing them, which is very different to what the Islamic tradition is outlining, that one should be regrettable. Rumi, the famous Muslim poet, he said this. He said, "Knowledge, wealth, and office, and rank, and fortune are a mischief in the hands of evil-natured. So therefore, the jihad was made obligatory for the true believers, this purpose, namely, that they might take their spear point from the hand of the madman." From the hand of the madman. And we don't have to look too far to find many examples of madmen holding spears. Take, for example, the Vietnam War, which still haunts the American public to this day. On the 16th of March 1968, Vietnamese civilians were massacred by American soldiers in the village of My Lai. The Charlie Company was under the command of Ernest Medina. He's not a Muslim, by the way, even though it's the son of Medina. And he was in charge of 120 infantrymen. And listen to the reports. You can find this documented. Listen to what's been documented here. He said, "Early in the morning, the soldiers were landed in the village by helicopter. Many were firing as they spread out, killing both people and animals. There was no sign of Viet Cong battalion, and no shots were fired at Charlie Company all day. But they carried on. They burnt down every house. They raped women and girls and then killed them. They stabbed women in their vaginas and disemboweled others or cut off their hands and scalps. Pregnant women had their stomachs slashed open and were left to die. There were gang rapes and killings by shootings. There were mass executions, dozens of people at a time, including old men, women, and children, were machine gunned in a ditch. In 4 hours, 500 villages were killed. 500 villages were killed." Now, we don't have to look far also in contemporary times of the effects of not training the one who engages in conflict, the inner training, the inner self. The Ahmadiyya killings involving the rape and murder of a 14-year-old girl and the murder of her family by US troops in Iraq. Blackwater Baghdad shootings. On September the 16th, 2007, Blackwater military contractors shot and killed 17 Iraqi civilians in cold blood. Again, Iraq. And not to mention Abu Ghraib, which involved the torture, rape, and homicide of prisoners in the care of American soldiers. And that is the effect. That is the effect of not engaging with that self. It's all very well being able to hold a gun and being able to shoot a target, but without that inner training that is essential, it can lead into those terrible, terrible outcomes. So we can conclude that from the philosophical aspect that it does not fit, terrorism does not fit with the philosophical idea of jihad. What about the theological injunctions pertaining to jihad? I would argue here also that it's a contradiction to these injunctions. You see, what the problem is that with Muslim extremists and also militant Islamophobes, if you like, is that when they interpret the Quran, they brush aside the careful scholarship that is involved. They ignore, they quote random texts, ignoring the coherent social vision that runs throughout the entire Islamic text, the Quranic text. And it's obvious that any collection of text must be read in the view of its coherent and overarching message. Otherwise, you can justify and come up with all sorts of ideas which are totally incoherent with the author's original ideas. Now, I'll give you an example of what some Muslim extremists do. Consider this Quranic verse, which is frequently quoted by Muslims who are hostile to other followers of the Abrahamic faith. Very nice. This is Surah 5:51. It says, O Muslim believers, do not take the Jews or Christians as allies. And this is somehow justified in being hostile to other faiths, Christians and Jews, for example. But then if we look at another verse, it puts this in context. Now listen to this. Muslims, God does not forbid you from being good to those who have not fought you in religion or driven you from your homes, or from being just towards them. God loves those who are just. God merely forbids you from taking as allies those who have fought you in your religion and driven you from your homes, and who have supported your expulsion. Any who take them as allies are wrongdoers. And one can also add to the discussion the Quranic verse that declares this: all who have faith in God and the last day and act righteously, including those who are Jews and Christians, will be rewarded by God in the afterlife. Do you see how that contextualizes the first quote? It is talking about people that are attacking you, not per se every person who is Christian and who is Jewish. So from the contextualization, we can understand that other faiths are our sister religions, our sister monotheistic religions, not our enemies. Now, not only that, but I also want to argue that the medieval or the Quranic or the medieval understanding of jihad overlaps with the Christian or Western understanding of a just war theory. The just war theory was developed for many, many centuries in dealing with how one should engage, for the reasons one and the conditions one should engage in war, and how they should engage within war. And if you read, for example, Mark Evans, a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Wales, he outlines, if you read his work, he outlines conditions for just war theory. And just war theory is split into two: jus ad bellum and jus in bello. And so jus ad bellum, to have the moral right to wage war, the following conditions must be respected. Number one, the cause is just. Number two, the justice of the cause is sufficiently great as to warrant warfare that does not negate countervailing values of equal or greater weight. Number three, warfare is genuinely a last resort, all peaceful alternatives which have been exhausted. Number four, one's own moral standing is not decisively compromised with respect to waging war in this instance. Note that foreign oil is not one of them. I had to get that one in, sorry. Just in bello, to fight a war justly, one must employ discrimination in the selection of targets. Number two, proportionality. And three, a just treatment of non-combatants, prisoners of war. Now, and when we look at the theological injunctions pertaining to jihad, guess what? They fall congruently within those conditions. For those that don't know the Islamic history, the Muslims in Mecca, they were driven out of Quraysh and they moved to Medina and they set up their society, their own community, their own state. And what happened was that the Muslims in Mecca, the Quraysh in Mecca were very upset with this, and so they decided to declare war. And the first verse speaking about engaging in war was this, Surah 22, 39 to 40. Those who have been attacked are permitted to take up arms because they have been wronged. God has the power to help them. Those who have been driven unjustly from their homes, only for saying, our Lord is God. If God did not repel some people by means of others, many, and listen to these words, many monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques, where God's name is much involved, would have been destroyed. So you can see that this verse, the first verse talking about Muslims engaging in warfare, is about individuals having the right to defend themselves because they have been oppressed and they do not have the freedom of religion. Not just for themselves, but for all religions. Jews, Christians, and so forth. So there is a right to defend yourself. Also, there is another, and then after that there was another verse, and it says this: why should you not fight in God's cause? and for those oppressed men, women, children who cry out, Lord, rescue us from this town whose people are oppressed. By your grace, give us a protector and give us a helper. So the other reason to engage in war is to help people that are oppressed, not necessarily Muslims. This is a general verse. So we find that it is congruent with the just theory of war, conditions for encountering or engaging in warfare. What about just in bello, the conditions within war? Well, the Quran, again, is congruent. Why? As you recall, it was what was advocated was discrimination, proportionality, and the well-treatment of prisoners of war. Before the Prophet, peace be upon him, engaged in warfare, he would instruct his soldiers for the following: do not kill any children, any women, elderly, or any sick people. Do not practice treachery or mutilation. Do not uproot or burn palm trees or cut fruit trees. Do not slaughter sheep, cow, or camels except for food. What about the condition not to be disproportionate in your aggression in war? Surah 2, 190 says this: fight in God's cause those who fight you, but do not overstep the limits. Because God does not love those who overstep the limits. So you can see there's an injunction there. A call from God not to transgress, to be proportionate in a response. And lastly, the other point was the fair treatment of prisoners of war. And for this, I have an example. And the example is this, is that the Prophet, peace be upon him, the Prophet, peace be upon him, when there were prisoners of war, he instructed, at that time, things were very, by the way, before, pre-Islam, the Jahiliyyah period, things are very different. When someone was captured as a prisoner of war, all sorts of horrible things happened to them. They would be sold, and you know, everything was okay. Because what the Arabs at that time believed, that if you were not part of this tribe, then you were almost subhuman, right? That meant that everything goes if they capture you. So the Arabs, they didn't know what to do at that time, so they asked the Prophet Muhammad, what should we do? And he said the following, he said, if you eat one morsel of food, give him one morsel of food. And even the narrations say there was one prisoner, and he spoke about his experience. And he said that sometimes they would even give him preference. In actual fact, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, gave him preference over himself. And another story of Imam Ali when he became the Khalif, the leader, which he's the fourth Khalif of the Islamic history, and there was an assassination attempt against him, and the man was successful, and he slashed his back, and later on he actually died. And when they captured this man, they asked Ali, Imam Ali, they said to him, what should we do with this man? And he said, he is our guest, look after him. So we can see from the Islamic tradition, very much like the samurai tradition that we spoke about, that it falls within the just theory of war. So we can safely, confidently conclude that terrorism is incompatible with Islam. It is incompatible with the philosophy of jihad, and it is also incompatible with the theological injunctions that pertain to jihad. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Alan. Very interesting talk. I'm sure it's more interesting to philosophy students than others. But anyway, jumping straight to Q&A, just with raise of hand for those who have questions. Any questions about the topic in general? Mark? Yeah.
When Imam Ali says, he's our guest, look after him, could he not be a little bit sarcastic and rather menacing?
you could argue that, but that's not what actually happened. He could have meant, yes, look after him, he's our guest, put him on a roaster. But he didn't actually do that. And like I said, and also Ali was an embodiment of the Prophet's message. And the Prophet before him also gave the practice of looking after presents. And this was shocking for the Arabs at that time. They were perplexed. That when they thought that they were we're talking about the non-Muslim Arabs, the Quraysh, that when they were caught, they really thought that the game was up. They weren't going to see their families anymore, that's the end of it. And most of them actually, sort of afterwards being released, actually converted because of their treatment. They could not believe that the way... There's actually another incident. There was a spy within the Muslim camp, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, Prophet Muhammad, he was praying and he put up his sword. And the spy actually came up behind him, grabbed the sword and put it to the Prophet's neck. And he said, "Who's going to save you now?" And the Prophet looked at him and said, "Allah, God will save me now." And the tradition says that he became nervous for whatever reason. You can give a naturalistic explanation, say he had an epileptic fit, whatever. That's not the point of the story. I'm not giving this example as a miracle. It's at the end, what happens is interesting. And the sword fell, and the man fell, and the Prophet picked up his sword back again, and put it to his neck and said, "Who's going to save you now?" And he said, "Allah, God's going to save you," and he let him go. He showed mercy to that individual. So, yes, I get what you're saying, but that's not really what was happening. It wasn't a Machiavellian individual.
So, with the past couple of years and the current media hype and this presentation of Islam as this inherently violent religion, there was something interesting that happened in the past year in Florida, where they had a protest against a show being presented on TLC, and it was presenting Islamic families in America as just regular people and what was going on. And did you hear about this?
I didn't know about the protest.
My question is with this media bias and clear agenda by the hegemon, who shall remain nameless, but I don't, what can truly be done in this case? I mean, is education the answer? I mean, my thought would be to just learn more, actually sit down and read the Quran, so that when you're talking to people, to have this knee-jerk reaction.
Well, what I would say is this: that no one is going to listen to Muslims. They're going to listen to people, good people like you, who can clearly see the contradiction. Who can clearly see there's a disproportionate imagery that's projected that shows Muslims as being violent. No one's going to listen to Muslims because they'll say, that's because you're a Muslim, right? So it's good people like yourself that can see the contradiction, who are concerned for what is true. They're not concerned for this agenda, as you put it. So it's going to take a lot of good non-Muslims to actually bring that fight out and actually show the incoherence and the negative portrayal, the wrong portrayal of Muslims. It's education. The very fact that you're here, that means that you're doing a great thing, because you're here to find out what we say rather than what Sam Harris says about us, for example. And and there are many people like yourself. That see this contradiction. The problem is this: those people are not in position of influence. Those people that are genuine and sincere non-Muslims, are not in positions of the media to say, hey, this is incorrect, this is a load of rubbish, that's not true. I mean, how many times have you seen an article on the front page of a newspaper? Actually, let me give you an example. There was a I think it was a Daily Mail, don't quote me, but it's one of these tabloid newspapers, and it said, "Muslim cabbie rejects blind man," right? Because the dog smells of bacon or something, I don't know. But anyway, okay, now, this was more or less on the front page. Big headline. Do you know where that happened? Texas. In some remote part of Texas. And the story was a farce anyway, it was a load of rubbish. I think the dog couldn't fit in, or something bizarre, something harmless, innocuous, right? So why is that new piece of information important? Because it sells papers. And unfortunately, the reason that they print this out is because we keep buying the papers, including Muslims. So stop buying the papers, buy credible papers, buy credible news material. This is, this sensationalization of Muslims is unfortunately sells papers. And also, when you do see a newspaper in this manner, don't just go, oh, that's really bad, that's the beginning, but also write and complain. How many Muslims, and sorry, can I just say that non-Muslims are really good at this, complaining, right? We have this culture here that, in a queue we start complaining, why is there no queue here, doesn't know anyone to line up. Unfortunately, and I'm speaking to the Muslims now, we are very bad. There's apathy within our community, we do not complain. Let me tell you something. When the BBC used the term occupied territory about Palestine, they get inundated by emails from Zionist individuals. Inundated. Even to the point of having hate mail. Right? How many Muslims have complained to the media outlets, say the BBC or ITV, when they use Muslim terrorist? How many? Put your hand up if you've ever sent an email to complain. Round of applause to the man over there. No, not one Muslim put their hands up, right? Not one Muslim. And thank you to you, sir. Thank you to you. And we need to get in this culture of complaining because things are going to get worse. And they are progressively getting worse. So, yeah, thanks for your comment.
Can I just finish?
Sure, yes, go ahead.
With that TLC response from the U.S. and Florida, the reason they didn't want the show to be shown on television in the U.S. was because it did not present their racist, prejudiced view of Islamic people as terrorists.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can see the clear agenda there. If you want to be, you're American, right?
Yeah.
Try and be president. I'll vote for you. Yes,
Nice already.
The lady.
I was going to say, thank you, Adam, for your talk. That was very insightful. I have 2 questions. One of them just to you about what's the hedging?
It's the global power, the dominant. It's the U.S.
In the dictionary it says US.
My other question was, you just mentioned Islamophobia. How would you define it? Fear, hatred, or both?
A phobia is an irrational fear of something, right? I used to work in personal development. And that's why I know a bit about NLP and all that sort of stuff and psychology. And we used to help people with phobias. And there was this woman who called up our offices one day, and she said, look, I've got this really bad fear that as soon as I step outside my house, wild animals will come and devour me. So I thought, maybe she's located in some part of Africa or something. And I said, so where do you live? And she said, I live in Kent. And that gives you an idea that it's irrational because it does not fit. It's irrational because there is no real threat. It's an invention in the mind. Just as that woman had this imaginary idea that wild animals would come and devour her in Kent, people have this irrational phobia of Muslims. So that's how I would define Islamophobia, this irrational fear that Muslims are somehow inherently bloodthirsty. We want to Islamicize everybody by the sword. Right? That's what I would consider Islamophobic. And can I just say, sorry, I have to have those virtues of the samurai and be patient, but sorry. I would say that Islamophobia is so toxic, that it clouds sane human beings, it clouds their judgment. I'll give you an example. Recently there was the incident where the American soldiers were caught urinating on Afghans. Did anyone see that?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Pamela Geller, who is an Islamophobe to the core, she said that was a good thing. She said, would we mind, it was good for them because they do wudu, right? They wash the dead bodies when they die. The Islamic tradition is that we wash the dead bodies, and she made fun out of it. That is pure hatred clouding a perfectly sane woman's mind. That's what. Just as that woman thought there were wild animals outside her home, this person thought that this could be somehow justified. Yeah, normal human beings are outraged by that behaviour, and yet she could not see it. She became ethically blind. Yes, the back with the glasses.
Hi there, thank you so much. Once again, that's Deen, and thank you very much for coming out and speaking. I just wanted to ask you, you've really clearly put it into context for us, and you very nicely explained that terrorism and Islam aren't linked. Could you please give us some narrative as to what has recently happened, and for example the 9/11 attacks and the 7/7 attacks, so I could get some more information as to why those aren't linked with the true perception of Islam. So, for example, what they've been.
Okay, this is a very so. Okay, so the young lady's saying that if Islam and terrorism is not linked, then why did we have such acts of terrorism? And I showed that there is a contradiction there. Why that happens? And this is a very complicated question, and it requires a whole lecture in itself. But what we have to understand is that the reason, and there are many theories, we can sort of learn from theories about evil. In secular studies, we want to understand why people commit evil. So, for example, why did the Holocaust happen? Why did, and that idea that extract that I gave you about the Vietnam War. Now you have to remember that these soldiers were everyday Americans, teenagers. Before they came to fight in Vietnam, they were playing basketball or football, right? So what philosophers want to know in analysing evil, they want to know how did these normal individuals become killing machines? Why did they commit evil? Because not everybody commits evil, right? These were normal people. And there's an interesting an account of a Nazi that was captured. His name was Eichmann. And what he used to do, he used to basically sign the papers that would sanction the deaths of thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews. And when he was captured, I think he was captured in Brazil, Argentina. Great, thank you. And so one of the what's the name of the philosopher, the woman? The name escapes me. Anyway, she writes about she went to go and interview this person, wanting to find out exactly what happened, and she was shocked to find this frail, fairly innocent-looking man. She was expecting to find this monster, this psychopath, but she found this normal-looking person, right? And there's even an incident in the courtrooms, in the trials, that they accused him of shooting a prisoner, and he got up, and he was calm throughout the entire trial. And at that point, he got up and got angry and said, "That's not me. I don't do things like that. I don't shoot people," right? So he was even outraged in killing someone. Now, what philosophers want to understand, why does that happen? Why can a normal person commit such evil? And there are many, many theories, and there are ideas that pertain to frustration, being powerless, right? There are ideas to do with defining the other as what they call an epistemic object. You categorize them as not human beings, but objects, right? And how does this happen in war? They use derogatory terms. What did the Nazis call Jews in the Second World War? Anyone know? Rats, vermin. What did the American soldiers refer to Vietnamese? Gooks, right? What do American soldiers refer to, American Marines refer to Muslims?
Terrorist.
Terrorists, yes.
Fanatic.
Ragheads. And
Brainwashed.
no, not so much brainwashed, but also sand niggers. Yeah? Dehumanizing your opponent. Because when you dehumanize them, when they're no longer human, you can objectify them and commit atrocities against them. Right? And this is a universal fact, universal phenomena, Because it doesn't just happen in war, but it also happens in every aspect of our life. For example, in pornography, you know the effects of objectifying women. And it's no surprise that when you objectify women in that way, that the reservations that you would have in harming someone will be lost. And that's why pornography now is heading in the direction of not so much sex, but violence. Because women have been objectified so much to that extent that what happens is that having, I don't want to be crude, but in pornography, in those kind of adult movies, the female character is not a character, it's not a person. What they are is the butt, the bosoms. That's what they are. They're not a person, right? This is objectifying individuals. So one of the reasons that I think that evil happens, that terrorism happens, because one side objectifies the other, right? And I think that also happens from the Muslim extremist perspective, that they objectify the other side because they refer to them in a derogatory sense. I'm not going to go into technicalities, but that's one. Another theory is because of frustration. Someone said that terrorism is a poor man's war. That when someone loses hope, when someone does not have the ability to have a fair fight and is oppressed, that they will result. But there are many, many reasons for that, and thank you for asking the question.
Okay, I try to put it carefully, but from what I heard you saying, the jihad, the definition you gave of it was that people want to remove the obstacle between peace and justice, and you said it has to be a virtuous cause. It has to be so I don't want to repeat everything.
Yeah.
But how is the distinction now between the people who commit terrorist acts? Because I think that's exactly the way how they perceive it themselves. Because there is a cause for injustice in their perception, and the only thing that they do is to fight to remove the obstacle between them and the justice. So for me, the distinction between the terrorists' perception of jihad and the normal perception of jihad wasn't clear.
Okay, so if you recall, I said that jihad, in order to be jihad, has to conform to those virtues of justice, right? Now, so if someone says, yes, in the name of jihad, I'm going to kill innocent civilians in X country, right? That would not be jihad, because to kill innocent people, whatever objective you have, is not just. So that will break down. Second point, I said that Islam, the Islamic tradition of understanding of jihad, overlaps with a just war theory. And the two components are the conditions of entering into war and within war. And what was the examples that I gave? Within war, that you can't kill women, children, elderly, you cannot cut down trees, cattle, and so it cannot be justified. What you're talking about is the theory and its application, right? You're talking about you're making that distinction. You're saying, okay, that's the theory, but in the mind of the terrorist, he's got this application. There's no room for that application. The theory is watertight. You cannot attack civilians. Because okay, if jihad is for virtue and justice, how can you compromise your virtue and justice to achieve virtue and justice? It doesn't make sense. I'll give you an analogy that I thought on the way here. Suppose I run a training company that teaches other companies how to sell in an ethical way. But I tell my salespeople to missell. Does that comply with my company's policy? It wouldn't, right? It wouldn't make sense. I would be hypocritical, if you like. So a terrorist thinking that jihad justifies killing of innocent civilians, terrorism in the sense of attacking civilians for political reasons, cannot be justified in any shape or form.
I feel like the word jihad has been blown out of proportion, and it's been, you know, shaped into this kind of horrific thing that Muslims do. When in reality, the word jihad, like for me, I left my country to seek education abroad, and that is called jihad of the nafs. Can you please, you know, discuss that?
Okay,
to
so
clarify?
jihad linguistically means to struggle in Arabic, right? To struggle. So if you struggle at your doing your exams, then you have committed jihad at university, if you like. Everyone's like, uh-oh. Okay, this is recorded, everyone's going down. Okay. So linguistically, but also in a sort of warfare sense, that it also means to engage in warfare. The mistake that some Muslims commit is that they become overly compensating. No, there's no warfare in Islam whatsoever. There's no fighting. No, jihad is just enough. You know, I'm just struggling to go to work. No one is going to buy that, because the Prophet, peace be upon him, did engage in war. But the point is, in what type of war and for what reason? I think that pacifism is an immoral position to maintain. Pacifism, the idea that we never encounter in any kind of physical fighting, any kind of warfare. I think that's an immoral position. Now think of it. Imagine during the Second World War that the Allies, for example, Britain, did not engage in warfare, did not enter the Second World War, and they let the Nazis kill more and more Jews. Would that be a moral position to maintain? No, it would not. That would not be a moral position to take. So in actual fact, the Allies in the Second World War were engaged in jihad. Believe it or not, they're actually engaged in jihad. If you understand what the Quran says about jihad. In America, they're fearful that Sharia is coming, right? That they don't want Sharia law. But guess what? One of the rights of an American is to defend himself, defend his property, to the point if he kills someone in his home, am I right? It is okay. Guess what? That's Sharia. Sharia law dictates that if a person, a man's home is his castle, right? Or a woman's castle, right? Queen's castle, right? Don't need sexist or anything. So a woman is even allowed to defend, right? If someone breaks into your home, if you kill that person, you're not at fault. That's Sharia, right? But when in the Western mind, when we think of Sharia, they think of hudud, they mean stoning, and etc., etc. There is Sharia. Do you know writing a contract, an agreement, documented contract? That is Sharia. The Sharia dictates that when you have an agreement, document it and have witnesses. You know when you sign an agreement and it says witnesses at the end? That's Sharia, right? Ooh. Right? Right?
I think on that we will end. Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you all for coming.